I remember the feeling I had when I first played Final Fantasy VII. I went in wondering if it was worth all of the hype. Over the course of the next 40 plus hours, I was treated to an emotional story, wonderful characters, fantastic music, and engaging combat system. It quickly became one of my favorite games of all time. It steals hours of my life away from me every time I open that jewel case. Final Fantasy VII was a groundbreaking title when it was released. It helped launch the entire PlayStation series and made the name Sony synonymous with video games. However, it definitely started to show its age sooner than 8 and 9. 3D technology was progressing rapidly, and by the time the PlayStation 2 era started, the Final Fantasy series became well renowned for its cutscenes and visuals. So much so that Square decided to make a movie just to flex their skills with computer graphics. This new reputation for graphical fidelity made Final Fantasy VII feel more antiquated than its successors. I want to take you back to E3 2005. Sony, in collaboration with Square Enix, wanted to showcase the power of the PlayStation 3 utilizing Square's new Crystal Tools engine. And what better way to do that than by remaking the opening of their most well-renowned title. This tech demo for Final Fantasy VII resonated with the game's core fans big time, and they now wanted a full-on remake. I personally was relatively indifferent to the idea, partly because the polygon graphics never really bothered me, but also because of my lack of faith in Square Enix. Everything they did with Final Fantasy VII after the original felt like disappointing fanfictions, and I never really thought the character designs translated well to the new realism approach the series had adopted. I was a bit more open to the idea after seeing how a company like Nintendo was able to remake Ocarina of Time without ruining the original's identity, but then my hopes were quickly dashed down after seeing what Square Enix did with their remake of Final Fantasy VI. The company would further tease fans at the PlayStation Experience conference in 2014. Shinji Hashimoto came on stage with the Final Fantasy VII title logo on screen. It looked like the public was finally going to get their remake. Instead, what they got was the PC port of the original coming to the PlayStation 4.
What the shit is that?
Thank you so much for the 1080p PS1 game.
It seriously felt like the company was intentionally trolling us at this point. Everyone pretty much gave up hope after that. Then came Sony's press conference at E3 2015. At first, it seemed like Square was still ignoring their fanbase with the announcement of World of Final Fantasy, but then the screens turned black with what looked like a live stream flowing between them. Then a trailer started to play. Every other scene seemed to feature something familiar, ultimately culminating with this, combined with the announcements for The Last Guardian and Shenmue 3, pretty much secured Sony as the top dog of E3 that year. It's funny to think that Final Fantasy VII once again came to their rescue almost 20 years after it originally came out. More of the game was revealed at the 2015 PlayStation Experience, almost as if to make up for the troll announcement of the last year's conference. This new trailer showcased a remade version of the bombing mission, the new character designs for Cloud and the members of Avalanche, and some actual gameplay. This trailer was also well received, with anticipation reaching an all-time high. But this was the last bit of news we'd hear for a long time. No footage was shown to the public for 4 years. In fact, some new details came out that raised serious concerns over the remake's future. We learned that the game was going to be released in multiple parts over the course of several games, the first of which focusing solely on Midgar. To pad out these separated releases, major additions would be made to the game's world, which is fine, but they also claimed they were going to make changes to the story, which is usually not what fans want. Then we learned that 2 years after the announcement of the game, many aspects of the initial build were scrapped and the scenario had not yet been fully realized. To make matters worse, the original director of Final Fantasy VII, Yoshinori Kitase, would not be directing the remake. So, Who would the new director be? None other than Tetsuya Nomura, the man who created the narrative nightmare that is Kingdom Hearts, and was also the director of fucking Advent Children. Nomura had no idea he was even going to be directing the game until he saw himself credited as such in an internal presentation video. That kind of disorganization does not inspire confidence. If that weren't enough, he wasn't the only notable director on this project. Final Fantasy VII Remake would also be co-directed by Motomu Toriyama, the director of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy.
I'm in danger!
To say that is troublesome would be an understatement, and with the lack of any updates, the fanbase grew more and more worried and all they could do was wait. The waiting continued until 2019 when we finally saw more of the game during Sony's Nintendo Direct ripoff, totally original State of Play. The trailer showed off Aerith, updated cinematics, and more polished character designs. It ended claiming more information would come in June, presumably during E3. Sure enough, E3 2019 came, and Square showed they weren't fucking around anymore. They started off with a short intro. Kitase came on stage and confirmed that not only would the game solely be focused on Midgar, but claimed that they had packed so much content into the game that it required 2 Blu-ray discs worth of storage. Then Neil Pabon came on stage and gave us a play-by-play on exactly how the new combat system would work and showed off the first boss fight with the Scorpion Sentinel. After this, they concluded the conference with another trailer showcasing more characters, more of the story, and more gameplay before ending with the long-awaited release date, March 3rd, 2020. From this point on, the updates became more and more frequent and it started to dawn on us. Holy shit, this is actually happening. The game was pushed back a month, which annoyed some, but at this point, having an actual release date at all was as important as having a date with Tifa at the Gold Saucer. And 5 years after its reveal, Final Fantasy VII Remake released on April 10th, 2020. Now that all of that backstory is out of the way, we can finally discuss the end result. As I stated before, I definitely had my reservations when the game was announced, but after the 2019 E3 reveal, I slowly started coming around. It really felt like they had an idea of what the original game was and how to expand on it without falling into the same tropes that Final Fantasy has for the last, 15 years? So, did they build my hopes up just to dash them down, or is this the definitive way to experience the first part of Final Fantasy VII? It's time to find out. Now, for this review, I have to spoil elements of the original game for reasons that will become apparent. The new elements that are introduced will have their own spoiler section that you can skip if you haven't played the remake yet. With all of that out of the way, let's take a look at Final Fantasy VII Remake. The story of this first game covers the original's plot up until our main group leaves Midgar, so if you know Final Fantasy VII, you're going to know a lot of the remake, which means I'm not going to talk about the story in great detail. Instead, I'm going to address how Square Enix went about stretching a 6-hour section of the original Final Fantasy VII into a 40-hour full retail release. They made good on their promise and did flesh out the game's world and its inhabitants. This is most notable with how much additional screen time characters like Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge get. There is an entire chapter with them where we learn Jessie's backstory and get to see the three of them work on something without Barrett. It was probably my favorite addition. We also get a more extensive look at the damage caused by the initial reactor bombing, and it's pretty intense. This was something only briefly touched on in the original, but when you see it here, it does an excellent job of bringing Avalanche's methods into question. I really liked those expansions, but there are a couple that are not that great. There are some that are simply not interesting, and then there are others that feel completely misplaced. These lesser additions are not awful, but they compound on one of Remake's biggest issues, which is its pacing. Despite how many new characters and story elements they added, there were definitely instances where it felt like the game was taking its time way more than needed. I figured this was going to be a slower paced retelling, so I was mostly fine with it, but some chapters are long just for the sake of extending the playtime rather than offering anything substantial. Their method of doing this is by having overly long puzzles or throwing cheap excuses for fights our way. I'll just say that after chapter 4, it becomes fairly easy to spot the additions that just serve as padding. On top of expansions, there are also several changes to the story. These I feel a bit more mixed on. Upon a first playthrough, there isn't a clear distinction between which ones were added to flesh out the world and characters, and which ones were added to steer them in an entirely new direction. At first, the changes don't seem to be a big deal considering most of them are minor and ultimately don't affect the outcome. The process of how Aerith and Cloud get into Don Corneo's mansion is very different, but the end result is the same as it was. But then there are other changes that directly impact the narrative and affect the story far more drastically. The most obvious of which are the ghost-like entities that pop up throughout the story. During my first playthrough, I actively hated these things. I really did. They seemed forced and did nothing but block progression. What makes this even more aggravating is that you don't find out what these things are until near the end of the game. However, once I knew what they were and played the game for a second time, my perception of them was altered dramatically. I understood exactly what they were doing throughout the story, and it is relatively clever, but even with this knowledge, I still don't like how they are implemented or how they affect the remake's future installments. Really biting my tongue here. Another big difference is how much we see of Sephiroth this time around. In the original, we don't see him in any capacity until the party leaves Midgar. This is because they wanted to build up to him. At first, he's just a name. Then we see how ruthless he can be. Then we hear of his connection with Cloud. Then we see a taste of his power. And when the party finally does encounter him, he comes through the fucking floor like he's straight out of a goddamn horror movie. In Remake, Cloud can't even take a piss without seeing Sephiroth's face in the toilet bowl giving him the evil sex eyes. Yeah, he shows up so freaking much. He's like an ex-boyfriend desperately trying to win you back.
Oh, Cloud, I am your everything.
His appearance to old school fans is frustrating at first because it feels like they're showing him too soon without a proper setup. To people who didn't play Final Fantasy VII, he just comes off as random and pointless. His goals are unclear and they don't fully understand what his connection with Cloud even is. It's not really interesting so much as it is confusing. He just pops in every now and then to be kind of a dick. I really didn't like how much we see of him at first, but just like the ghosts, there is a reason for this. It serves the plot, but not in the way the fanbase was expecting. Plot points like this sort of cement the fact that Remake warrants a second playthrough to fully appreciate the story beyond what we see on the surface. The overall narrative of this game is mostly good, but these monkey wrenches throw it off balance and muddy the waters. Of course, fans of the original would be able to understand the majority of the story just fine, but I'm not quite sure how newcomers would react to it. Sometimes, it seems like you are required to already have a decent amount of knowledge of Final Fantasy VII to fully grasp what's happening. It feels like the game has a little bit of an identity crisis. I say this because the problem with Remake's narrative is that it seems to have three different goals clashing with each other. It's trying to be an expansion of the original, but it's also trying to be a retelling, while also trying to be its own unique experience. It's being pulled in all these separate directions, but it never really feels like it commits to any one of them. This might be because they tried to do this balancing act while also holding off the major plot changes and surprises for the late game. Because of that, the final chapter feels really out of place and over the top when compared to the one preceding it. When you go from the end of chapter 17 to the end of chapter 18, you'll be left with one thought.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
I would say that Remake mostly succeeds in its goals of expanding on the world and the story of Final Fantasy VII. It manages to feel fresh to fans of the original and offers its own individual appeal. The downside is that the narrative takes a couple of hits along the way and the pacing is too slow. I think people may find it easy to overlook these flaws because I've always praised the main party of Final Fantasy VII as being some of my favorite characters in all of gaming. So the number one thing I was worried about with Remake was how Square Enix was going to handle them, especially with Tetsuya Nomura in charge. Ever since the original game, the cast of Final Fantasy VII have been written like caricatures of themselves rather than how they actually were. That's why the biggest shock of Remake is that the characters are beyond perfect. In fact, one could even say that Remake portrays them even better. The characters in this game absolutely feel like extensions of their original representations and not like the overly simplified versions we thought they'd be. They really nailed all of them in a way that I wasn't expecting. They've been made to feel more human than ever before. I think Barrett benefited the most from this treatment. In the original, they definitely played up his goofier traits more, and those aren't gone by any means. They've just been toned down a bit to let other aspects of his personality show more, like how loving and caring he can be. The obvious showcase of this are all of his interactions with his daughter Marlene. The way he talks to her, the way he talks about her, it's all really touching. You can see how he struggles with going out on missions knowing there's a chance he won't come back and Marlene will be left alone. At his core, it's easy to see that all he wants is a good life for his kid. His demeanor changes so quickly when he talks to her. He goes from sounding like a badass to sounding like a gentle giant. It's really effective, yet he still has his explosive temper and all the pent-up rage we were expecting. When he's required to, he feels like the leader Avalanche needs. He takes charge of the missions and you can see why Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge follow him. They may disagree with some of his methods, but they know he's genuinely a good person at his core. The writers were able to expand upon the more personal sides of Barrett while still retaining his humor and over-the-top personality. I absolutely love almost everything they did with him. I wasn't crazy about the sunglasses at first. It looked like he was trying to audition to be the next Blade. However, when he takes them off, you can see a genuine sadness in his eyes. They look so heavy and tired, and I honestly feel they show the burden he carries. It seems like the sunglasses are another part of the brave face he puts on for his team. Once I realized that, I didn't mind them, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Hey Barrett, are we starting this mission?
Yeah. Just let me put my sunglasses on.
Sunglasses? It's 9 p.m.
Since the original, Aerith has been portrayed as overly innocent and slightly angelic. Remake fixes this and turns her back into the good old snarky, flirty little schizo we all know and love. It's great. She really is a big old bowl of sass in this game who doesn't take any shit, especially now that she's apparently a WWE fan.
And here comes Aerith with the chair!
You can tell she enjoys playing dumb just to tease people, but it's never mean-spirited. It often feels like there's a double meaning to what she says, and we can't tell if she's up to something or if she's a little... Towards the end of the game, we do see her start talking to the planet and touching into her Cetra roots, and it's at that point we aren't entirely sure what she knows. It's a similar type of ambiguity that the original did, but given the story changes, there's an additional layer to it that really calls into question if she's aware of what's to come. I'll touch more into that during the spoilers section, but like the first game, upon a second playthrough, you'll pick up on all of her subtle clues, and it will be very eye-opening. Honestly, Aerith is just a delight throughout this entire game. She's kind, sarcastic, and totally endearing. She's almost perfect.
Shit.
Never mind, she is perfect. I would say that Tifa probably has the weakest characterization out of the main party, but that doesn't mean she's bad. Tifa is the best waifu ever, and if any of you bitches disagree with me, I'll fight you on the side of the street. The problem is that Tifa's character development in the original comes into play well after the group leaves Midgar, so since this game ends at Midgar, we don't get to explore as much of her character as the others, especially since a lot of her story is intertwined with Cloud's, so while she's not the most developed, her personality is pretty faithful. She's still just as sweet and caring while also being a total badass in combat. She ain't afraid to punch some metal robots right in their fucking face. Her interactions with Cloud are fantastic, and you can tell she knows something is off, but doesn't want to say anything. She only wants to keep an eye on him. Her loyalty to her friend and her loyalty to her team are a constant source of internal conflict for her that we see during the early chapters. She wants to get close to Cloud, but at the same time, she wants to help Avalanche rid the world of Shinra. She becomes even more conflicted because she doesn't agree with the methods Barrett is taking. She sees the damage both parties are causing to Midgar, and it's a huge drain on her. She doesn't want to cause any more pain to the community she's come to love. Remake really shows off how significant she is to the people of Sector 7. She's that local bartender that everyone loves. Even with less development than the other main party members, it's clear that Tifa is a good person who wants the fighting to end, and she will beat the living fuck out of whoever she needs to keep the peace. She's the girl next door that you will absolutely want to go on a date with. So what do you say, Tifa? Me, you, and the bed. The character I was worried the most about is Cloud. Cloud is quite possibly my favorite video game character of all time, and he has never been represented well in anything other than the first Final Fantasy VII. Every appearance he has made has reduced him to an angsty, brooding emo fuck. They oversimplified him so much that he just became a desktop wallpaper for guys who like to decorate their bedrooms with Daredevil posters and drywall holes. That's why I was utterly astonished at how well they translated Cloud. He is almost exactly like his original portrayal. He starts off as a selfish mercenary who only wants his pay and doesn't care about Avalanche's goals or even their well-being. However, it's made clear that this is all a farce. He tries to come off as this badass, but when he's caught off guard, you can see that he does care about the people around him and is much kinder than he lets on. That doesn't mean he's all good though. He does almost go through with killing an innocent person just because he thinks they will talk. He's not afraid of confrontation and he can definitely back it up, but he's also a bit socially awkward at times. Whenever anyone shows him genuine kindness, he doesn't know how to react. It's so amusing to watch how uncomfortable he gets when Aerith tries to high-five him and be all buddy-buddy. He's just not used to allowing himself to be relaxed or friendly with people. It's obvious that he's kind of lost and wants friends, even though he puts on this act to push people away. He still has all of his memory flashes and they are used pretty effectively for the most part. Plus, they definitely have fun with his character in some self-aware ways, like when he tries to use his 6-foot-tall sword indoors. Yeah, maybe get a gun, idiot. And yes, they keep the cross-dressing sequence and it's still pretty fucking great. There is one way they use him for comedy that's really out of character, but other than that, they captured Cloud in a satisfying way. Like Tifa, his characterization expands well past Midgar, so we still don't have a full grasp on him when the game ends, but we understand him to the point that it's still satisfying. I never felt like there was stuff missing with him, just stuff we didn't get to yet, which is fine and gives me hope that he can only get even better. The fact that they were able to show off this many layers of his personality in only one game really gives me faith in his portrayal in the future installments. I guess I'll briefly talk about Red 13. I mean, there isn't much to say. He looks great and his character is pretty much the same as it was. He's a bit snarkier, but that's the only real difference in terms of personality. He doesn't come in until near the end of the game, and he is not a playable character. I'm sure this is disappointing to some, but I kind of expected it. I figured the developers wouldn't go through the effort of programming another party member who is only playable for 2 chapters. So we'll have to wait and see where the next game takes us with Red 13. Maybe this time they'll actually call him Nanaki instead of calling him by his, I guess, slave name. The main cast of Remake is outstanding and really captures the spirit of the original. All of the character interactions are so perfect and these conversations just write themselves. Their relationships with each other grow more and more over the course of the game. Cloud and Barret slowly build a mutual respect for each other and you really get to see Aerith and Tifa form a natural and endearing friendship. This is all wonderful. Even at times when the game is dragging, it's made more bearable with the wonderful banter between your party members. Characters are a big deal to me, and the bar is set even higher when it's a remake of my favorite RPG of all time. That's why I am so baffled that they were able to do them justice. This treatment even extends to the supporting cast, the most obvious of which are the members of Avalanche. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse get far more screen time and more development. Biggs and Wedge are pretty much the same, although this time around Biggs is really reminding me of Spike from Cowboy Bebop. Jesse, on the other hand, has had a pretty noticeable character change. In the original, she was a little shy, kind of ditzy, and had an innocent little crush on Cloud. In the remake, she straight up asks Cloud if he wants to fuck.
Mind coming over tomorrow night? My roommates should all be out for a while.
She's more aggressive and more sarcastic. She gives off kind of a Claire Redfield vibe. I'm honestly fine with this change because it makes sense given what she's doing. Jessie actually gets a backstory too, and it does a great job of fleshing her out, and it complements her new personality very well. I imagine a lot of newcomers will fall in love with this character quickly. Another thing they did was give a minor character like Johnny much more screen time and gave him a more important role in Wall Market. And sure, I often found him annoying, but even I can't deny he was far more memorable and fleshed out here than he used to be. The same can be said for Don Corneo, who really does feel like a horny mafia kingpin instead of a comic relief bad guy. Also, good God, Marlene is just precious. She is absolutely adorable. It seriously feels like they looked at almost every character model in the original game and said, what's their story? And sometimes the new stories they come up with result in new characters being introduced. For example, the coachman who took Tifa to Don Corneo is now part of a Chocobo UPS company in Wall Market led by Sam Elliott. Chocobo Sam is just one of many fresh faces in the remake. There's also Roche, who is a member of Soldier that pops up in Chapter 4, and he's fucking nuts. He's a thrill seeker who seems to get off on pushing himself to the absolute limit, and I'm not convinced he isn't low-key gay for Cloud.
The engine roars with excitement. It hungers to be set free!
I didn't like him at first because he's way too flashy and ridiculous, but the other characters in the game point out how over the top he is, and I think this is enough to let the player know that his behavior is not normal. Man, even the landlord Marl in Sector 7 is awesome. She's one of those characters that you don't need to know much about, but instantly get a feel for her just off some short interactions. I could totally see her fitting in the original. All these new and expanded character moments do a wonderful job of making the world feel more alive. Everyone feels a bit more grounded to keep the overall tone of the game consistent, but it doesn't take any of the fun away. There's still plenty of nice goofy shit. The only character I have my reservations about is Sephiroth. And it's not even that he's bad, it's just that he speaks in cryptic bullshit all the time, way more than he did back in the day. Don't get me wrong, he still loves toying with Cloud's emotions and making him doubt himself, but his goals are different this time around and can only really be understood after beating the game. To newcomers, his motivation is unclear and they'd most likely have no idea what he's trying to accomplish. His character is fine, I guess, but I just wasn't too into how he was utilized. With all of that out of the way, I mean it when I say that I was delighted with how great the characters in this game were. I really thought they were going to be wooden and shallow stereotypes, but nope. They are excellent and I loved pretty much everyone. The main cast is the best they've ever been, the supporting cast is fantastic, and the majority of new characters are welcomed additions. What a triumph. Unlike the original, Remake features a real-time combat system with monsters appearing on the field rather than through random encounters. When battles begin, the player takes control of whoever the party leader is while the other members are controlled by the AI. You can execute standard attacks by pressing the square button. Doing these help fill up your ATB meter. When a bar of ATB is filled, the player can switch to tactical mode. This slows down the combat and brings up a list of commands. These include special abilities, magic, summons, limit breaks, and items. Any of these will consume at least 1 bar of ATB. The leader is not the only one you can issue these commands to. The player can also have their other party members perform these actions if they have a full ATB bar. The AI controlled characters are not super effective in battle and build ATB much slower than the leader, but the player can actually switch control to a different character and launch standard attacks to fill their gauges more quickly. Additionally, each character varies in playstyle and they all have their own unique set of abilities. Hey Square, did you guys watch my Lightning Returns review?
I think it would have been better to do away with the schematas. This combat system would have worked better if you had a party of say 3 characters, and rather than switching schematas, you switch controls between each character and these characters would have distinct skills from each other.
I'll take my royalty check now. So, is this combat system everything I wanted? For the most part, yeah. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed Remake's battle system. It has turn-based elements, constant player involvement, and requires actual strategy. My favorite aspect of the combat is how different each party member is. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Cloud uses brute force and has good speed, but is pretty average in defense. Barret is slow but tanky and is able to execute physical attacks from a distance. Tifa is fast and powerful but has weak defense stats. And Aerith has exceptional magical abilities and can attack from afar, but has no real physical capabilities. This is actually something that I feel Remake does better. As much as I love the original, the party members didn't feel that different from each other. Sure, they had their own stats and the limit breaks, but that was about it. They were all pretty customizable, and while it did offer a fair amount of player freedom, it also failed to incentivize using each party member. You could get by most of the game just using the same 3 characters. Not here. Everyone feels distinct and I love using all of them. I can unload a barrage of attacks with one character, then switch to another to continue my assault. On top of that, every one of them is fun to play as. Tifa is probably my favorite because of how fast and strong she is, and Cloud is a close second, but that doesn't mean I dislike playing as Aerith or Barret. I enjoy them as well. I never feel like I'm being forced to play someone against my will. They all offer something different for the player. Each party member has their own unique skills mapped to the triangle button, but the player can add more skills to their arsenal thanks to the weapons in this game. Every weapon comes with a built-in skill, and performing these enough times lets that character retain this ability even when they're using other weapons. The weapons also come with their own skill trees that expand as the weapon itself gains levels. Besides the special abilities, the weapons also offer passive stat bonuses. This means that every weapon in the game retains their usefulness throughout the entire playthrough. This is a massive improvement. In the original, the weapons would become increasingly replaceable as the player progressed through the story with no real reason to hang on to inferior equipment unless they offered extra materia growth. Now, all of them have something to offer. The Mithril Saber and gloves give Cloud and Tifa an edge against enemies they can't reach with their physical attacks, and the Wrecking Ball can turn Barret into a melee powerhouse. And of course we still have the materia system. I was honestly surprised that it's relatively unchanged from the original. I thought they were going to tone this down, but no, they actually added new materia to the game to complement the new battle system. This time around, materias don't spawn new copies when mastered, but there are almost no penalties on the characters for equipping them. Another change is how summon materia is used. Unlike the original, each character can only have one summon. Summons can be activated during a boss battle or when the player takes enough damage, essentially acting as another limit break almost. Once activated, the summon will fight as another AI ally, but it can be instructed to use its abilities by any character with a full ATB gauge. Once its time limit is reached, the summon will execute its ultimate attack before leaving. I'm pretty indifferent to how the summons are utilized. They're cool, but I kinda wish they had their own ATB bar to use, since their abilities aren't always that powerful. The stagger meter from the 13 trilogy returns here, and it's fine. This time around, you only really need to pay attention to it during boss battles, and it does a decent job of informing the player of each boss's weak points without outright saying it. Otherwise, it's pretty unintrusive. It doesn't really hurt how great the combat system is. There are some problems I have with the battles though, the first of which being the camera. It can get a little janky in some tight areas, which can be troublesome during these high-speed fights. This isn't a constant problem. Really, I have more of an issue with the lock-on system. It locks your focus on a specific enemy, but it doesn't lock the camera on them. This means you can easily lose that enemy's place or accidentally switch to a different target. This was a pretty constant issue. I'm sure they wanted us to be able to see the other monsters during combat, but they could have just zoomed the camera out to show more of the battlefield during the lock-on mode. You can get used to it, but I hope this is another thing that will be tweaked in the future. Another problem is aerial combat. Now, I didn't have much of an issue with this on normal difficulty. Sure, Cloud and Tifa struggled with it, but it just incentivized me to use magic or to switch to Aerith or Barret. But this becomes a more prominent issue when playing on hard mode. Hard mode does not allow the player to use items. This means you can't reliably replenish your MP, so the player ends up not using magic during fights because they don't know when they'll get more. This results in them forcing themselves to use Cloud and Tifa's physical attacks against aerial foes, and this just drags the battle out longer than it should be. I'm not opposed to restricting item usage during battle, but you can't even use them in the field, which feels a little cheap. Sure, you can use chakra or prayer, but they can only do so much. The benches also don't restore your magic on this difficulty, which is stupid. Besides hard mode, Remake offers classic mode where all the party members are controlled via AI and the player can engage once an ATB bar is full. It's an attempt to make the game feel like a traditional turn-based RPG. I thought I would like this, but I don't. Using this removes player input during the early fights, and I just don't feel like the combat system was built to be used in this way. I also wish that who you picked as your party leader changed who you control in the field. For the vast majority of the game, you can only navigate the field with Cloud, but the other three characters have moments when the player gets to use them outside of combat. Like I said in my review of the last story, if you're going to go through the effort of making each character playable anyway, why not let me choose when I control them? That's a nitpick, but always being forced to navigate with Cloud was one of the only things I disliked about the original, so I was hoping they would change it here. The limit break system is pretty similar to the original, but it definitely does not build up nearly as quickly as it used to. On top of that, your limit breaks cannot be saved because your gauge empties after every battle, which is a downgrade. They still do a great deal of damage, which is always nice, but this time around, your limit breaks can easily miss their intended target. This is because each character does a cool little pose before attacking, and while they're posing, the enemies can move out of the way. This just seems like a dumb oversight that could have easily been fixed. All they needed to do was treat the limit breaks the same way the Super Smash Bros. Series treats their final smash attacks. Hopefully the future games will address this issue. The monsters in this game are great. There are some new enemies, but there are also a ton of returning fan favorites with updated designs. And like the main party, they have been made to feel more distinct and have more attacks for the player to deal with. They're all pretty fun to fight. A downside is that because the game is more linear, the monsters feel a bit more preordained, probably in an effort to reduce grinding. Thankfully, that grindy feeling never came with standard enemies. The real emphasis of the battle system comes in the bosses. There are a decent amount of them, and the player has to approach each one of them differently. The game even takes some regular enemies from the original and makes them boss fights. One in particular showed me that Square Enix knows the fanbase's memes, cause the presentation of this fight was absolutely incredible. The fight itself is actually pretty tough too. One thing that's annoying about the boss fights is that most of them go through phases, and it's easy to have a boss ignore a powerful attack from you because a cutscene starts to show them changing their tactics. This can easily be fixed by having each phase of the boss have its own separate health bar, so that way the player can see when the best time is to unload. Remake has one major flaw with the enemies though. The game builds up that Sephiroth is supposed to be the scariest, most deadly force in the world, but they forgot that even the mighty Sephiroth can be easily killed by this game's one true ruler. He is beauty, he is grace, he will stab you in the fucking face. With all that said, I think Remake's combat system is excellent. It's got the speed and the flashiness that Square likes, but it still manages to be strategic and satisfying. It needs a couple of minor tweaks here and there with the camera and the animation locks, but otherwise, it's easy to fall in love with this.
Keep it up.
Yeah, you too.
Remake has plenty of side quests, but they vary in quality. The motivation for the ones in Sector 7 is actually pretty good. Cloud needs work, so he starts taking on random odd jobs to make a name for himself so he can get more work. The side quests in Sector 7 are mostly monster hunts, which is fine, but 2 of them force you to go to a place, to kill a monster, to go back to the quest giver, just to go back to the same place and kill a different monster. It's really blatant padding. One of them is extra annoying because it's in a maze-like factory. There is one side quest that forces you to find cats around town, which, yeah, is kind of lame and not really fun, but it is amusing to see Mr. Badass Cloud basically being a little girl's cat wrangler. A lot of the side quests contribute to fleshing out the sector's communities, but not that effectively. I think Sector 5 does this the best, but it's still not great. The problem is that a lot of the side quests feel repetitive. They are all either monster hunts, escort missions, or fetch quests. This could work, but the motivation for them is uninteresting and blandly presented. Sometimes they can just be annoying.
Yeah? Huh. Like that.
Isn't that right, Cloud?
Isn't that right, Cloud?
The rewards are decent, but the quests themselves just feel like chores. Remake offers a couple of mini games, and they're also just okay. You can play darts, work out, play whack-a-box, battle in the arena, battle in the VR, or go on a motorcycle ride. Darts is just darts. Nothing special about it, but it's fine. I wish there were other bar games though. Come on, Square. You shoved card games in our face after 7 came out. Why not throw in a card game here? Even something as simple as poker. I would love to play strip poker with this game's sexiest character, Wedge. The exercise minigames are just like the original, and they're definitely amusing, especially with the remixed battle music, but they don't offer much outside of some giggles. Whack-a-box is actually kind of fun. You have to earn points by breaking as many boxes as possible within the time limit. You can then trade your points for items, some of which you can only get from playing this minigame. It's actually alright. There's now an arena in Wall Market that you can fight at to earn new limit breaks, and I actually liked it. It's not as challenging as the original one in the Gold Saucer because they don't constantly handicap you, but the rewards are absolutely worth it. You can also fight within a VR headset by talking to Chadley. Chadley is an emotionless white-haired kid who speaks in a monotone throughout the whole game. You know, he's starting to remind me of someone. These fights impose some handicaps and are more interesting. Chadley is actually gathering battle intel on Cloud, and there's a list of objectives for the player to hit within the main menu. Satisfying these conditions results in Chadley selling the player unique materia at very low prices, or sometimes for free. This was probably my favorite bit of side content. It's a shame that this kid looks like one of the worst things ever created by humans. There are also 2 chapters where you ride a motorcycle. These portions of the game are not very good. It actually plays very similar to the biking minigames in the original, and it's just as janky. I would be fine with that, but there's actually 2 boss battles that take place on the motorcycle, and that's when it's bad. You're mostly restricted to just melee combat, you get slowed down constantly, and your only ranged attack charge is slow and can easily be interrupted or just miss. Regular enemies are fine because they don't need you to do much other than whack them with your sword, but these motorcycle sections were not properly designed for actual battle. And it seems that the developers knew that because they allow you to skip these fights when replaying. On the one hand, I respect that they offer that, but if they knew it was bad, why not fix it? Or at the very least, get rid of the need for 2 boss battles. The side activities in Remake are okay. Most of them are generic, some are annoying, and a couple are pretty cool. You're definitely incentivized to do them, and the placement of them is mostly unintrusive to the main story, so they're worth your time, you just won't fall in love with them. I don't think that anyone can deny that this is a gorgeous ass game. There's a reason it comes with 2 Blu-ray discs. The detail in the surroundings are very impressive for a late-gen PS4 game. The lighting especially really complements these environments. This is most evident in the first bombing mission. Just look at the ground. Oh my god, it's pretty. The detail on the character models is great as well. You can fucking see Cloud's birthmarks, man. Final Fantasy VII used pre-rendered backgrounds to simulate the environments you traversed through. Remake does something similar, but this time it's with the pre-rendered skyboxes. Most of these look incredible and blend seamlessly with the actual rendered models thanks to the intricate details and the complementary lighting. Sector 7 is a gorgeous example of this. The combination of these components really showcase how stunning the visuals can be. It's not always perfect though. The game has a serious issue with texture loading, most notably in the early outdoor areas and especially the apartment doors. They look like Nintendo 64 textures. There are also some skyboxes that are really low res and stick out like a sore thumb. The first notable one would be the Sector 4 slums below us in the second bombing mission. This shit looks like a JPEG. It lacks any sense of depth. The game does change lighting based on environmental exposure, and sometimes it doesn't look good. Look at this! I can't fucking see! I feel like I just walked in on Marl in the shower. I should also mention that the cinematography of this game is great, and they do a pretty good job of framing the shots during the emotional dialogue-heavy scenes. The majority of the action scenes also look really damn cool without going too over the top, though that gets a little muddy towards the end. In terms of character design, Remake obviously went for a more realistic approach. I didn't like it in Advent Children, and while I don't love it here, I think this game struck a far better balance between being realistic and holding true to the original character designs. Their features are a bit more exaggerated and they're allowed to be more cartoony, which complements the goofier moments well enough. Don Corneo looks like a bubbly Jabba the Hutt character, and Barrett is still a freaking giant of a man. Seriously, his fist is like the size of Tifa's head. How does he not stick out immediately when Shinra is looking for Avalanche?
Keep an eye out, citizen. We've heard that a terrorist group plans to bomb a Mako reactor.
Oh yeah? Who on earth would blow up Mako Reactor 5 at 8 p.m. tonight?
I did notice though that it's painfully obvious which characters were designed by Nomura in the 90s and which ones were designed by Nomura now. Oh, and don't you worry, he made sure that everyone had more belts and tighter fitting suits this time around. While the original gets a bad rep for its somewhat spotty localization, Remake has an absolutely fantastic script. The dialogue and writing here are superb, and they do a good job with having the characters explain their feelings and thoughts without going too far. There are still moments where just the facial reactions and subtle voice cues are all the player needs. There are some really beautiful conversations that showcase both the characters' emotions and the actors' talents. There are so many good examples of this, but I think my personal favorite is the optional scene between Tifa and Cloud. It's utterly fantastic and a perfect example of Remake absolutely nailing its cinematic feel. The game can be beautiful when it wants to be, but it's also not afraid to get a little filthy.
Ooh, you got a mouth on you. I'm gonna enjoy breaking it in.
I need an adult! I was genuinely surprised by the amount of swearing. I am shocked this is still rated T. This is rated T by like 90s standards, cause this game needs to have its mouth washed out with soap.
You greedy bastard! Scum-sucking piece of shit-festering asshole!
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so raw and abrasive, but it totally fits this universe and these characters. I want to take a moment and really compliment the voice cast and the voice direction. Damn near everyone in this game sounds perfect, and these actors are nailing most of the lines they are given. John Eric Bentley as Barrett deserves special mention because he is able to capture Barrett's over-the-top rage, his goofiness, and his tender loving side better than I could have ever expected. This is a tall order, and he completely knocked it out of the park. Brianna White also does a great job as Aerith. She gives her that sweet, innocent facade while still pulling off her true snarky and cynical attitude. Britt Baron as Tifa is great, and she brings a lot of humanity and emotion to a character who could be seen as underwritten in this first game. And Cody Christian as Cloud is pretty good. I think his voice suits the character more than Steve Burton, and his acting is better, but there are definitely a few times in the story where I feel like they didn't direct him properly and his lines fall a little flat. Not blaming him at all because he's great throughout the majority of the game, there's just a couple of underacted lines here and there. The rest of the voice cast is as solid as the main cast, and the acting is so good that I changed my perspective on some of the casting decisions. When I first heard Hojo, I thought the voice didn't fit, but after getting through his cutscenes, I thought that this guy absolutely pulled it off, and now I am totally fine with the voice. There are some NPCs with weird voices though. This dude in Sector 7 sounds just like Patrick Warburton.
And just where do you think you're going? Move along now.
Bro, if you don't let me through the gate, I'm gonna shoot you.
And then I'll shoot you with a flare, and then I'll use a D-Rash and burn 2 survival crackers to make s'mores over the crackling fire that used to be your chest cavity.
God damn, dude. And Chocobo Sam here sounds like he's about to sell me a Dodge pickup truck.
That's how it is, huh? Well, I get a lot of customers. Hard to keep track of them all. Built with honor. Forged with pride.
The only bad performance I can think of is the restaurant owner in Wall Market.
Great! That spells serious business! If you're right about this, my beloved restaurant could be a ticking time bomb waiting to explode.
Who let their drunk uncle in the studio? Like the last few games, the NPCs will have conversations you can overhear when you're just walking around. Unlike the 13 trilogy, they actually have pretty interesting shit to say, which is nice, but the sound mixing of it is a bit off. It's all based on how close you are to the people who are talking, so if you're running down a crowded area, expect to be bombarded with a bunch of dialogue. It's like someone is reading all of the Star Wars crawls at once.
What kind of person is the kind of person who goes
around I could ignore this when I'm just fucking around in town, but during the interactive cutscenes, it becomes aggravating to try and hear the main party speak while some jackass talks about the discount hooker he got.
I saw Sector 8 on the news. It was like a war zone.
The news is just another Shinra mouthpiece.
She sucked my dick for like 3 gil.
I'll spread whatever lies Shinra tells me.
I think she said her name was Chocolina.
It wasn't that bad?
Also, while the animated cutscenes look great, the ones that play out when you're talking to a character in the field have some stiff and awkward animations. One thing I did notice in my playthrough was a lot of grunting and other paralanguage that's common in Japanese media, but a little abrasive to Western audiences. I get that the localization team had to work around lip movements and such, but I feel a fair amount of them could have been toned down. I'm usually numb to this sort of thing, so if even I noticed it, then I think it's fair to say that the vocal licks got a bit excessive at points. Remake has many little nostalgia nods to the original Final Fantasy VII, and I loved most of these, like the 2 guards outside of Sector 7, having to pull the levers at the same time, the squat minigame with the cross-dressers, this photo of the PS1 7th Heaven, and sneaking out of Aerith's house. The majority of the remake feels like it was made with real love and appreciation for the original game. I feel like these nods appeal to us veterans without being too intrusive to newcomers. There's a really out of place one during the fall of the Sector 7 plate. Meanwhile, they were able to reference Crisis Core in a way that felt very natural. I think the only nod I got really sick of was Barrett humming the victory fanfare. He does it way too much. The first time, it's awesome. But after the 28th time, yay, he did the thing again. Overall, I'd have to say that the presentation of Remake is really well done, which is to be expected because even the worst recent Final Fantasy games have managed to be good eye candy. But even with that in mind, this game was still able to impress me in areas where I thought it would falter, particularly in the voice acting and the character designs. They're great. Look, even Sakaguchi is clapping for them. I just hope eventually the texture issues get worked out on the PS4 version, because they are a bit distracting. Even with a few technical hiccups, Remake is a gorgeous game the whole way through. Since Remake takes place solely in Midgar, most of us knew going in that the game would not feature an open world. In the original, Midgar was a fairly linear part of the game that was used to keep players focused on the complex narrative before allowing them to deviate off the rails at their own leisure. Because of that approach, and because of Motomu Toriyama's involvement, many players were understandably worried that Remake would echo what we saw in Final Fantasy XIII, and that's not entirely true. Let me explain. Remake is indeed a fairly linear experience in the same vein as Final Fantasy X. However, it is far less aggravating to traverse since there are no random encounters. Because of the way Remake is structured, there are many areas that you only visit once for a specific chapter. After that, they become inaccessible. The entirety of Midgar is connected via a series of linear roads leading from sector to sector. There are only 3 main areas you can move about freely: Sector 7, Sector 5, and Sector 6/Wall Market. This is reduced to only 2 after the fall of the Sector 7 plate. So towards the later part of the game, you can only freely navigate Sector 5 and Wall Market. That's it. For me, this was a negative. Even though I expected linearity in the roads, I still don't like the layout of the towns themselves. They are all a series of alleyways with almost no open areas. In some respects, this is fairly realistic because the alleys are packed with homes, vendors, and shops. But they are pretty cramped together, so it does give off a fairly claustrophobic feeling. This is enhanced by the fact that there isn't much to interact with in the backgrounds. A lot of it is decoration. Also, unlike the original, you can't go inside many of the houses. These issues result in the world looking dense, but actually being fairly shallow. The roads between towns can be a real chore sometimes. They are all full of monsters and puzzles, which would be fine if the puzzles were more interesting. There are some that are fairly dull and others that are just annoying. The road to Wall Market easily being the worst. Good God, this puzzle sucks. Hey, remember that little hand in the original? Have fun jerking off with it, asshole. The areas that you only visit during certain chapters are somewhat maze-like, and they also feature some relatively unimpressive level design. Sometimes their puzzles don't even make sense. During the second bombing run, there's a section where you have to disable the giant artificial suns of Sector 4 in order to have enough power for the lift. That seems excessive. Maybe Shinra needs Mako energy because they don't know how electricity works. I'm honestly fine with not revisiting these areas because they're not good enough to warrant any more of my time. As far as being a way to guide the player forward in the story, the level design in Remake gets the job done, I guess. It's not as dull as 13 or as annoying as 10, but it's still not great. As I said before, visually, it's gorgeous. There were some changes made from the original to let us experience Midgar in a different way. For example, you actually get to see the city in the daylight, and it is the most beautiful pile of trash I have ever seen. To me, this alone made Midgar feel fresh again for the first time in years. We also get to explore topside a bit with Sector 7 and Sector 8. These really show off how different daily life is when compared to the slums. These look like regular nice towns. The people here just live their lives like anyone else, completely oblivious to the suffering of those below them. It's easy to see this and understand why they would side with Shinra. They are comfortably ignorant and have no real reason to be skeptical when everything for them has worked out just fine. This is a small thing, but it really does add another layer to Avalanche's struggle and makes their ideology harder to sell. Another change is how Wall Market is presented. In the original, it was a sleazy, dirty-looking flea market with an adjacent strip club. Here, it has been changed to a more extravagant and lively red light district, more akin to something like Kabukicho. It feels like it's straight out of Yakuza. This is very different, but it's a change that honestly makes sense. Besides making Wall Market stand out more, it really gives it that anything-goes party atmosphere, and it complements all the crazy stuff you have to do here. These adjustments are great because we get to experience sides of Midgar that were only hinted at before. From an artistic standpoint, I really like what they did with the 3 sectors we saw in the first game. But they're the only ones we get to visit. I feel like it was a missed opportunity to not let us explore more of Midgar. Why stop at the same old sectors we've seen before? We get to be above Sector 4 during the second bombing mission. Why not let us actually go down there and check it out for ourselves? Or maybe elaborate on Sectors 2 and 3 since we know literally nothing about them. If you're going to put the entire game in Midgar, make Midgar feel as lifelike as an actual city would be. Don't get me wrong, the sectors that we do see showcase daily life beautifully, but they could have pushed it further. I could have done with less puzzles and elongated roads in favor of showing other sectors of the city with more interesting side quests. Towards the end of the game, you can fast travel using a Chocobo taxi service, which is pretty good, but you only go between Sector 5 and 6, so it's not a huge help. If they included more sectors, it would have been way cooler to take the train to get around. Then I would really feel like I live in Midgar. Like Final Fantasy X, Remake's world is gorgeous to look at, but offers little outside of that. It's a cool and fun backdrop to run through, but it's nothing to write home about. The original Final Fantasy VII was composed by series veteran Nobuo Uematsu. Because of the new direction this installment took, he decided that the way he went about scoring it should also be different. He treated it like a film soundtrack and chose to compose music that reflected the mood of the scenes instead of making overly strong melodies. This resulted in a cinematic soundtrack that featured some of his strongest and most memorable work to date. It was epic, emotional, and incredibly ambitious. It's one of my favorite soundtracks ever and really encapsulates the unique feeling of the world and characters 7 had. Most of Remake's soundtrack is newly arranged versions of those songs, and I'm happy to say that the vast majority of them sound absolutely fantastic. The style of Remake takes on an even more orchestral approach, and most of the tracks sound better than they ever have before. On top of that, the way the music is used is highly effective. Look at this transition from this cutscene to the newly arranged battle score. Fucking awesome! And when Cloud first goes to see Tifa, the music is used adaptively. The first few chords of Tifa's theme keep repeating until you initiate the cutscene, and it's just a beautiful recreation of the original. The overworld theme that used to play on the world map is used for Sector 7, and it's made to sound so harmonious and beautiful. Hearing this while seeing Sector 7 in the daylight was just one of the most breathtaking experiences I've had from a game in a long time. This alone really made me embrace Remake when I first played it. So many of the compositions are just outstanding recreations. Let me play a few of my favorites for comparison. If that weren't enough, you can also collect music CDs throughout the game. These CDs contain jukebox versions of some classic themes, and they also sound great. There are some remixes that took me a bit to warm up to. The original Wall Market theme was turned into an EDM remix, and it was bizarre when I first heard it. I didn't like it at first, but I embraced it after a while. However, I still think it does not fit the area in which it is used. Though the original was scored by Uematsu, he was not the main composer behind Remake. Remake featured contributions by many composers, and their work can most commonly be found in the parts of the game that feature new story beats. I feel that the most notable contributors of this soundtrack outside of Uematsu would be Masashi Hamauzu and Mitsuto Suzuki. Hamauzu's work has been featured in Final Fantasy X, Dirge of Cerberus, 13, and World of Final Fantasy. My experiences with him have been a bit of a mixed bag. I really enjoyed his work on Final Fantasy X, but I absolutely hated his score for 13. Thankfully, his music here is on par with what he did on 10. His early tracks within Sector 7 are great and really harken back to that feeling Final Fantasy had 20 years ago. They carry this feeling of action while, in reality, just being standard background music. It's the type of repetitive that you actually don't mind hearing. His more solemn tracks also impressed me this time around. Unlike in 13, this music is used appropriately and with characters I actually enjoy, so I'm able to fully appreciate the emotional depths he's dipping into. Ultimately, I feel he was an excellent choice for Remake. Mitsuto Suzuki was also a contributor. Some of you may remember him as the composer of Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns. And if you saw my reviews of those games, you know that I thought their soundtracks were terrible. And his tracks here are also not very good. The vast majority of his tracks are just techno-babble nonsense. He has one or two good ambient ones, and his Wall Market theme honestly does fit the new feel of the town, but the vast majority of his work in this game was not enjoyable for me, especially because it took me out of my nostalgia and reminded me, oh yeah, this is still a modern Final Fantasy game. Like I said, Nobuo Uematsu was not the main composer of the new arrangements, however, he did contribute one new song, and it's called Hollow. This is the song that plays during the credits and what they use during the trailers, and I really enjoyed it. It complements the feeling of Final Fantasy VII so well. It conveys this feeling of melancholy and dread, but as it goes on, it becomes this rock ballad that feels like it belongs in a badass western or something. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not my favorite track by any means, but it is an excellent showcase of the emotions within this world. Overall, Remake's soundtrack is predictably enjoyable. The arrangements of the original songs are great, and most of the new tracks complement the game well. The techno stuff is where it lost me a bit, but none of it was enough to make me want to mute my TV. In fact, the contrast reminded me how brilliant Uematsu is. Shine bright, you beautiful bastard. You know most of this is going to be about that goddamn ending, so let me just touch on the stuff along the way before I get to that. So chapters 1 through 4 I have next to no issues with. I thought these were excellent. Chapters 1 through 3 were wonderful reimaginations of the original's opening, and chapter 4 was a solid addition that did a great job developing the members of Avalanche. However, the second bombing mission takes up chapters 5, 6, and 7, and it just goes on way too long. Chapter 7 especially feels incredibly repetitive and dull. Every one of these labs and hallways look exactly the same and they just drag on too much. The first bombing mission was only one chapter and it was a lot of fun. The only reason this one is so long is solely to pad out the game. But after those annoying chapters, we get reintroduced to Aerith in chapter 8, and this is another great chapter. We get to meet the Turks, we have freedom to mess around in sector 5, and best of all, we get to enjoy all the snarky dialogue between Cloud and Aerith. It's a lot of fun. The beginning of Chapter 9 contains some of the worst level design in the game, with very inappropriate music. The only thing that makes this bearable is the banter between Cloud and Aerith. Otherwise, this part sucks. But you have to grind through it so you can party at Wall Market, which is where the game gets a bit ridiculous. First of all, what they did with Hell House is freaking awesome. They took one of the weirdest monsters from the original and turned it into an epic arena battle that ended with such reverence for the Final Fantasy VII fans that I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. But then there's other things that went too far, like the dance scene. It's fucking bonkers, and I'll be honest, I didn't like it. Don't get me wrong, it's fucking hilarious, and out of context, it's great. My issue with the dance scene is the execution of it. Cloud gets too into it and too good at it. Towards the end, him and Andrea are perfectly in sync, and it feels a little weird that Cloud knows exactly which move Andrea will make before he does it. Has Cloud been going to raves in his spare time? I would have liked this scene more if the dance was Cloud awkwardly fumbling around trying to copy Andrea while having a look of panic on his face as the dancing got more and more intense. That would have been a better way to have this crazy moment and have it still be funny without contradicting Cloud's character. Also, he lets Andrea get away with a little too much to the point where it feels wrong. I don't think Cloud would do this little twirl and actually take a bow. Sure, he did something like this in the original during the Gold Saucer play, but he wasn't in drag during that. This wasn't bad, I just feel like it could have been tweaked a bit to keep more in line with Cloud's character. Other than that issue, the majority of Chapter 9 was fantastic and the most bombastic portion of the game. Chapter 10 in the sewers is okay. The level design is average at best, but this expansion makes sense to me. Don Corneo dropping people into the sewers was basically his way of killing them, but in the original, it was pretty short and easy to escape from. Here, it's a long and monster-filled labyrinth, which makes for a more plausible death trap. Chapter 11 gives a more expansive look at the train graveyard. This is a nice idea, but the placement of it is totally wrong. This whole thing should have been an optional side quest. This should not have been included in the main story, especially when this chapter takes place after our party finds out that Shinra is going to drop the Sector 7 plate. The narrative, the characters, and the player want to rush to the pillar, but instead we get stopped in our tracks for this random ass little ghost story. Plus, for some reason they make Tifa act scared and kinda defenseless, which is pretty at odds with how she's portrayed in the rest of the game. This bitch isn't afraid of oversized lizards with weapons, but Casper the Friendly Ghost is where she draws the line. Sure, we get to see some insight on Aerith's childhood, but there are much better times to showcase this. If they really wanted to make this mandatory, they should have put it before the second bombing mission. It's adjacent to Sector 7, and story-wise, there's no real rush to bomb another reactor. In fact, it would probably make more sense to space out the attacks to let security calm down. They could have done this chapter with Tifa, Cloud, and anyone from Avalanche, and then they could just put the Aerith backstory parts somewhere else. I don't hate this chapter, I just hate the placement of it. Chapter 12 is pretty great. It's very emotional and shows us how Aerith was captured by Shinra, and we get some more hints that she knows more than she's letting on. During the fall of the Sector 7 plate, there is one fan nod that feels really out of place. Showing Cait Sith here is totally random and jarring. I can only imagine how confused new players would be watching this scene. Oh my god, the plate is falling! Oh, the destruction! The chaos! The innocent lives! The fuck is that? This is too distracting. Chapter 13 was okay. It's cool that we actually get to see the party look for survivors, but gameplay-wise, it was really repetitive and kinda bland. We get to see that Wedge actually survives this time around, which I thought was interesting. I enjoyed the story parts of this chapter, just not the gameplay. Chapter 14 is the opposite. Gameplay-wise, I love this chapter. It's our last bit of freedom, so it's full of side quests, extra character moments, fast travel. Oh Lord, the Great One returns to claim our souls! And some amusing mini-games. Story-wise though, it feels kinda random. We get to see more of Don Corneo, which is cool, but the story between him and Leslie is another plot point that feels like it should have been an optional side quest. To make matters worse, we have to go through the fucking sewers again. We just did this 4 chapters ago. Chapter 15 expands on going to the upper plate, and I like this one. It's another expansion that makes sense to me, and I really liked the lighting and that moment where our characters overlook the ruins of Sector 7. This sequence was nothing interesting in the original, but now, it's a haunting and reflective journey up. Chapter 16 was fine. It's a little long-winded, but the Shinra building was a pretty lengthy dungeon anyway, so it's only natural that this version would be too. Okay, now let's get to the ending. This is when it becomes a clusterfuck, because that's when we find out that this isn't really a remake of Final Fantasy VII. No. This is a sequel to Advent Children. Let me explain. So the ghosts are called Whispers. They are known as the Arbiters of Fate. They are beings born from the planet who serve as the enforcers of destiny. They are here to ensure that everything in the story goes how it's supposed to. The reason we see them so much is because of Sephiroth. He is causing them to take an active role in manipulating the plot and the characters. This is because Sephiroth is either from the future or knows the future. I think he is from the future because we see black feathers laying around from his wing, and he didn't get that canon-wise until Advent Children. Either way, he's trying to alter the course of destiny in his favor. Throughout the game, there is a battle of fate playing out in the background where Sephiroth is trying to alter the timeline, but the Whispers come in to keep the story as it was in the original. Sephiroth shows up in Sector 1 to lure Cloud away from Aerith, so the Whispers come in to hold her in place so Cloud can still run into her. Sephiroth's actions start causing butterfly effects that the Whispers have to fix. For example, Barret pays off Cloud early and now he's not going on the second bombing mission. The Whispers have to fix this, so they actually make him oversleep. While he's sleeping, they attack Avalanche at 7th Heaven. They injure Jessie so she can't go on the mission, so Barret is forced to rehire Cloud. They stop Cloud from killing Reno in the church, and they stop Aerith from falling too soon. They are present at every major story deviation. They surround Cloud and Barret so they can't stop Rude from blowing up the Sector 7 pillar. They hold Wedge in place under the plate so he can be killed, but this time they fail and Wedge lives. They stop the group from seeing the underground Shinra lab full of human test subjects because Cloud starts to remember being one. Later, Hojo is about to reveal to Cloud that he was never in Soldier, but the Whispers come in and take him away. These things are like the Secret Service of plot.
No, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Nope, nothing to see at all, nothing to see at all. Go about your business, citizen, nothing to see here at all.
From the looks of it, they can only be seen by those whose fate is subject to change, which is why Rufus can see them, but Sang cannot. The Whispers are the ones trying to preserve the original story, while Sephiroth is trying to change it. But it looks like Sephiroth and the Whispers aren't the only ones who played Final Fantasy VII. It seems like Aerith also knows the future. You can clearly see a couple instances where she is either playing dumb or alluding to having greater knowledge. She knows Cloud is a soldier before he tells her, and she knows to get Marlene to safety before Tifa can even finish her sentence. She knows what's supposed to happen, but unlike Sephiroth, Aerith is just trying to stay on her predetermined fate. Even though it doesn't end well for her, she doesn't care. She knows what has to happen. But it seems that, throughout the game, Sephiroth is giving Cloud visions of the future by manipulating the Genova cells in his body. His plan is to show Cloud all the horrible events that are to come so he can emotionally manipulate Cloud into helping him change the future. At first, Cloud is the only one who can see Sephiroth, but once the group is in the Shinra building, Sephiroth stops hiding and makes his presence known to everyone. Shit starts getting crazy when Sephiroth kills President Shinra and then kills Barret. But the Whispers revive him because he wasn't supposed to die here. Though there have been many minor changes throughout the story, so far, everything has still gone the way it was supposed to. So when I knew I was getting close to the end, it dawned on me. The last boss you fought before leaving Midgar was the Motor Ball. I knew there was no way Remake could end with that, so I wondered what they were gonna do to make it more epic. Maybe a fight with Sephiroth? Well, yes, but... oh boy. So after the Motor Ball chase, the gang runs into Sephiroth on the edge of Midgar. They get ready to fight him, but the Whispers come and cover all of Midgar in a dome to try and contain this manipulation of fate. Then we cut to outside of Midgar where we see... what the fuck? Zack? This is the ending of Crisis Core, what the hell is it doing here? Back in Midgar, Sephiroth cuts a portal out of the Whispers and challenges the party to follow him. Here is where Aerith warns everyone that if they follow and defeat him, their future will change and she won't know what comes next. They decide to challenge their fate and follow Sephiroth into the void. I gotta say, given the context, Red 13 has very little reason to go through with this. He barely knows these people right now, but he's about to challenge Destiny with them? Damn. Lab rat dogs really are a man's best friend. Once you step through the portal... yes! It becomes an absolute clusterfuck of madness! Welcome to Nomura's Carnival of Fun! We went from fighting a robot on a highway to battling the god of time or some shit. If that weren't crazy enough,
Get a load of this. Remember when Cloud's sword got stopped by the doorframe in Sector 7? Yeah, now we can just slice through parts of buildings like they're nothing. The party gets a vision of the future, and it's the end of the original Final Fantasy VII. Red 13 says that what they saw is their future if they fail this fight. As the gang starts fighting these 3 Whisper guys, they see even more of their future. When they defeat Whisper Weapon, or whatever this guy wants to be called, they finally start to fight Sephiroth, and then it basically turns into fucking Advent Children, both in terms of coloring and how over the top the action gets. This is just excessive. We're constantly jumping around between future vision, crazy fight moves, and visual overload. When you beat Sephiroth, he takes Cloud to a place called the Edge of Creation. Here, Sephiroth asks Cloud to join him in defying destiny, but Cloud refuses. Hey Sephiroth, maybe you could have convinced him easier if you went back in time and didn't kill his mother. That tends to ruffle some feathers. They recreate the ending of the original, however this time, Cloud's Omni-Slash is ineffective and he is disarmed. Sephiroth then leaves him with a cryptic message before vanishing. I think his reasoning for not killing Cloud is because he got what he wanted. Destiny has changed, so technically he still won. But if Cloud is going to try to stop you, then maybe you should kill him. With Sephiroth and the Whispers defeated, we cut to outside of Midgar, where Zack actually survives his final stand. However, it seems that now, this is an alternate timeline because Stamp the Dog is totally different. We changed our future, yet we changed the past. Wait a minute.
If you change the future, you change the past.
Oh, fuck you, Toriyama! Not only is Zack alive, but it looks like Biggs survived as well. They also seem to imply that Jessie is here because her glove is on the desk. It cuts to the group outside of Midgar, and much like the original, their plan is to hunt down Sephiroth and put a stop to whatever he is planning. As the group walks away from Midgar, in an alternate timeline, Cloud and Zack are walking towards it. Aerith looks up to the sky, and the game tells us that the unknown journey will continue. So that's the ending, and wow. Where do I start? Okay, let's start with the fact that nobody asked for this. I don't think anyone who wanted a remake of Final Fantasy VII wanted it to turn into an alternate universe sort of sequel. I think everyone would have been happy with a straightforward retelling of the original. This feels like a fan fiction, but like a pretty good fan fiction. Let's disregard the fact that no one wanted this and look at the ending as is. It's an interesting idea for sure, but even with that in mind, there are still problems with it from a narrative point of view. Let's start with the Whispers. Their identity and goals are revealed way too late. We get the explanation of what they are 1 chapter before the game ends. Because of that, the escalation between chapter 17 and 18 is just absurd. They're throwing too much at the player at once. Maybe they could have added another chapter where the party finds some clues about them in some old text, or they could have just revealed their identity earlier. This would have also made them less annoying for the player to deal with. In fact, it would have probably made them more interesting. The narrative decision to keep this a secret until the end just makes the last few moments of the game confusing and crazy. I'm assuming Zack surviving is in a different timeline because Stamp the Dog is different, but who the fuck is going to recognize that right away? Hey guys, remember that dog we saw in chapter 5 and in the background occasionally? He's different here. Woo, timey-wimey. It's another example of Nomura wanting us to pay attention to every little detail no matter how trivial it may seem, which in some respects is interesting, but Final Fantasy VII already had a pretty intricate plot. Now you're throwing this shit in there too? This also adds to my point that Remake is not kind to those who didn't play the original, because while newcomers are trying to follow the story of the original, they're also being bombarded with future visions and references to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. To really get the most out of Remake, you would have to play the original Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core, and watch Advent Children. Now I know the counter argument is going to be that this opens the door for the developers to do new things with these characters and the world of Final Fantasy VII. It's a way for the players to get what they've wanted, while also letting the developers fulfill their need to be creative. And yes, this is true, but here's my problem with that. First of all, we're already experiencing these characters in a new way just by the nature of how this game is. Even if the story was exactly the same, the graphics, the music, the combat, the presentation, everything is already so different that it would still feel like a fresh new experience.
Also, the developers already did get to make new stuff in this world when they made some of these expansions. If they really wanted to make something new, they could have just saved it for Final Fantasy XVI. They've already tried doing new things with these characters before, to varying degrees of success I might add. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII is honestly not great, so this would have been an ideal moment to ignore that shit, not embrace it. And yes, it does mean the story can go in any direction, but that's just not what the fanbase wanted. The original story is one of the most engaging and interesting narratives ever told in a video game. It's wonderfully paced, full of complexities, has a natural escalation, and very strong character dynamics. The only thing that's holding it back for the mass majority of people is simply how poorly it has aged in their eyes. The hope with Remake was that the old fans could experience Final Fantasy VII the way they remembered it during their first playthrough. Sure, the ending increases the amount of conversation surrounding the game, but those discussions will quickly devolve into just arguing over the merits of the story changes rather than the game as a whole. Remake's identity is a clash between the fans wanting an updated version of the same game and the developers wanting to make something new. This just makes the player feel like a child in the middle of his parents' divorce. It's not a total mess by any means, but it's safe to say that it's messy and could have been handled better. If they decided to flesh this stuff out more naturally over the course of the story, instead of throwing it all at us towards the end, then the last chapter wouldn't seem so ridiculous. We could still disagree with the story changes, but we could at least understand them better and not let them overshadow how good the rest of the game was. Look, no matter what I say, I don't think anyone is going to be satisfied by this review. All I can do is offer my closing thoughts. If we disregard the last chapter, Remake is honestly a solid game with a lot of great things in it. The characters are fantastic with layers of complexity. Most of the expansions are pretty good and do let us experience this world in new ways. The battle system is a lot of fun and probably one of the best in the series. The music is mostly incredible. Sure, there are a couple of odd remixes, but the vast majority of the new arrangements are so effective and full of emotion, and the dynamic use of it really made everything feel more impactful. The presentation is astounding at points, even with a few technical bugs. Honestly, most of the game is great, but it's got some major issues. For one, it's way too linear. Even expecting that going in, this is still too restrictive, and the mundane side quests don't incentivize me enough to explore this world more. The pacing is way too slow, and certain chapters are either overly padded or totally out of place. And even if we disregard the changes, the overall narrative is still uneven and has clashing objectives for the sake of a twist ending. The final score for Final Fantasy VII Remake is an 8 out of 10. Even though I think it was handled poorly, I don't hate the ending. I did at first, but now I really don't. But I also don't care where the next installments go from here. I'm mildly interested, but that's it. I know a lot of fans hate this game now, but I don't. You know why? Because it doesn't take anything away from the original. Sure, Remake can be seen as a missed opportunity, but I knew it wasn't going to be the definitive version of Final Fantasy VII, because it could never be. Final Fantasy VII is a one-of-a-kind game that can't be replaced. The hours I spent with it are memories that no amount of flashy new graphics could undo. Even with basic polygons and no voice acting, I still can't forget how I felt when I first played it. I was intrigued by Avalanche's struggle, I was enamored with its battle system, I was amused by the lighthearted schemes, I was afraid of what the truth was, I was distraught over what we lost, I was inspired by Cloud's journey, and I was satisfied by its ending. I could never hate Remake because it reminded me how much I loved the original and how much I love these characters. Remake reaffirmed my feelings and in some respects celebrated them with me, and I really appreciated that. The two games can coexist and the developers can do whatever they want in the next installment. I'll check it out and see where they go, but I'll always look at it and the rest of the compilation for what it is. Fun fan fiction that I can easily ignore. Unlike the original, which stands proud on its own and left an impact on me that I still feel even after all these years.